Yeah. Welcome to Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace in Europe. And I'm very honored to have a very special guest, an expert from the European Council of Foreign Affairs, from the European Council of the Senior Policy Fellow, Gustav Gressel, who is expert for wider Europe, for Eastern Partnership, and for Russia especially. And there could be no important and no decisive relation for Europe these days. I would like to welcome you very much, Gustav, and please present yourself to the international audience.
Hi, my name is Gustav Gressel. As you already said, I'm Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. That's not a EU official body or administrative unit. It's a private entity think tank. So we are free to say and write whatever we think. Of course, we receive funding from various government sources. You can all look that up on our website. But the good thing about European governments is that opinions are so diverse, so you will always please and insult one state or the other with any opinion. So we really are not dependent on one or the other. To my private background, I'm just like you, Austrian. I worked in the Austrian Ministry of Defense before I joined ECFR in 2014. I also was a brief time professional officer in the Austrian Army, and basically, if you know the Austrian political sphere, there's only one region Austria has a professional foreign policy, that's the Western Balkans, and the rest is basically amateur work. So during my tenure in the Ministry of Defense, I was tasked with analyzing a lot of countries and regions that all fell into the non-Balkan bracket, which is where they don't have professionals for. But Russia stuck since the war in Georgia. It got more into Russia and it got more into Ukraine. I had at the time, very heretic hypothesis that the next war will not be a repetition of the Georgian war, but you will have a war for Crimea. And I even got kicked out of one workshop because I said that once in 2009. Sort of the prediction then, of course, stuck. And in 2014, ECFR remembered, there's this Austrian guy who actually told us long before. And so I was called very quickly whether I would like to join. Stefan Meister, whom you might also know, was sort of my predecessor, and he decided to go back to DGRP because DGRP was restructuring the Russia department after they have gotten rid of Alexander Ra. So he got back there and I got Berlin. I'm still there. I have two kids who were now born and are being raised in Berlin. So they are talking Prussian dialect German now. So it's the typical migrant fate, you know, you start to integrate and I even know what Konfitüre is by now. So.
There may be a worse destiny than being in the capital of Germany and being in the center of European foreign policy making. Gustav, let me ask you about the decisive year that changed the world, the year 2014, the Crimea annexation, the war in Donbass. This really shook the world fundamentals. How did you experience it? What is your take on what happened in 2014?
Oh, that was a very a roller coaster year for me personally, because I have to be careful not to give away too many internals of the Ministry of Defense. But of course, I was sort of tasked with reporting from that region and judging. And there were in the Ministry of Defense a few people that warned that this would happen in sort of certain spread across certain departments of the ministry. But of course, at the time, this was not what the government was wanting to hear. So at a certain time, when, for example, when the Maidan started in 2013 and tried to discuss the various options, the Russians had to pressure Ukraine into not signing the association agreement. The notion that putting Crimea at risk was met with comments like, well, the Russians have to take control of the North Caucasus first, but they won't conquer anything. That's nonsense. And stuff like that. I was actually sort of then the Maidan happened, and we had this tense January with all the shootings. I actually had one friend and a cousin who were at the Maidan. Not first grade cousin, but so it was enormously tense for me personally. I was sent on holiday then on March, April when the military operation started. We went to Japan for relaxation. I still can remember accessing the cell phone every night to look whether Ukraine is still there. There were intensive troop movements at the time. The Russians moved up in they had the Crimea, the 25,000 men roughly on Crimea. They also moved into 3 operative maneuver groups, one on the Belarusian border, one in Voronezh and one in Rostov-on-Don, to kind of threaten Ukraine militarily. They started to have this GRU people infiltrating into the Donbas, starting to take government buildings. They did so basically with the help of organized crime structures. They had recruited and organized since 2008 roughly. So I think 2009 we had the first warning of people who were on the ground that the Russians were the Russian intelligence, the military intelligence was starting to mend ties with these Titushki to have a second option in Donbas apart from Crimea, which was of course heavily ignored by our political competent leaders, but they activated basically what had been put in place before. The Ukrainians were afraid of a total invasion. They didn't react militarily, first of all, because they had very little to react with. Second of all, they they basically kept these few troops they had to the West Bank to show to the population that there would be some kind of defense in case the Russians invaded, but that gave the Russians a free hand in the Donbas to do whatever they wanted. But limited police forces there from the Ukrainian side, some loyal to Kiev, just tried to report because they were not in a position. They were policemen with pistols that were suddenly confronted with lorries, Russian lorries stacked with Spetsnaz and arms, who demanded free passage, and they were like, if you remember physically a usual pre-reform Ukrainian militia, this was usually 2 men, about 1.60 meters tall and equally wide. The equivalent of the American donut policeman, and they would have an old Makarov pistol, and their main job was to extort money from unsuspecting car drivers, but not to stop Russian special operation forces. That's not within their range. So the whole thing unfolded. And the Ukrainian voluntary movements were kind of the reaction to the incompetence of the state, created in various forms and sent into war over summer. They did basically a good job against the insurgent part of Ukraine, or in eastern Ukraine, because a large part of the Donbas population was basically indifferent towards what was going on. The Ukrainian state was not very trusted because it was corrupt, not because of what the Russians believed, that there was a national different identity, but the state was inefficient and corrupt, and usually just extorted money from you, so you don't trust it. On the other side, Russia wasn't, Russia was well known, so it wasn't equally trusted because it was pretty much the same. East Ukrainians who have relatives in Russia know what Russia is about. They don't need to necessarily watch Russian TV. So they were basically watching this as bystanders, as the competence and skills and the people who were part of these operations were known in Ukraine. People started to sympathize with the Ukrainian state. As I said before, the Russians basically recruited organized crime structures for their informal fighters. They also, at some point, so I've talked to voluntaries who came from Slavyansk and then retook the town as voluntary battalions. Their moment where they sort of started to self-organizing was when the Russians went into the prisons and basically gave the inmates a badge and a gun and say, you know, as long as you work for us, you have authority. And you can roughly imagine how a bunch of inmates would use this kind of power, and they did so accordingly. Which then, of course, angered everybody else in the town. And as people know that sort of these were bad guys that shouldn't have guns in the first place, people started to think, well, then we should defend themselves. And that was the origin of sort of their local voluntary battalion. Nothing geopolitical, nothing identity politics, no language issue, nothing. This was purely, you know, people's lives being touched. And this was a sorry, my cold is catching up with me. This is basically a story that you can, in one or the other iteration, repeat in pretty every major village or town in eastern Ukraine, be it Mariupol, be it Slavyansk, Severodonetsk, whatever, you know, and with people starting to flee the zone because they felt insecure and spreading the word about what's going on. And this was told from kitchen to kitchen what was going on. You know, independent from propaganda TV and sort of state information, the resistance and the stiffness of the Ukrainians to do something about themselves hardened. And that was basically the situation when in August, September, especially September, Russia conventionally and sent its normal army to stop the Ukrainians, because the voluntaries were sort of very good at keeping the separatists at bay and depriving them from freely using the countryside. They were not in the force and strength enough to take all the urban centers that the separatists had barricaded them in. Also, one needs to know that sort of at the time, you know, there was no clear front. There were certain centers that were in separatist hands, and sort of vast swath of the country you could roam freely, or you could swing as a private citizen the Ukrainian flag. You were unmolested. So there was not yet an established front and established centers. It was more sort of chaotic patchwork, local loyalties switching or being declared just as mayors and local politicians felt they should do. And then basically in August, the Ukrainian army started to really gear up, and they started to organize and systematize the resistance and kind of collaborate the work of the battalions with troops of the Ukrainian army. Of course, there was much inefficiency at the time. There were rivalries about commands, about who would take what, but nevertheless, it was effective, and the Ukrainians started to regain territory quite on a pace. The war plan of the Ukrainians that at the time was to kind of move along the Sea of Azov and then cut the separatists off the Russian border. And once you cut them off the Russian border, you can take these urban pockets one by one. And that was then interfered by a conventional Russian military intervention, which culminated in the Battle of Slavyansk, but there were sort of many other instances where the forces Ukraine has sent, they were too exposed in terms of their position, because they sort of tried to cut off the separatists, and they were cut off themselves then in return. The Ukrainians at some time in summer started to reinforce these cut-off pockets with transport aircraft. The Russians in turn infiltrated heavy SAM systems into Donbass, and we all know that they accidentally shot down one airliner. This was MH17. But still, I remember the time in the Ministry of Defense when sort of colleagues who were close to either the Socialist Party or the Freedom Party, ideologically, actually, that doesn't really matter. There's no difference. Immediately came up with conspiracy theories. what had happened. And I'm a former air defense officer, so I know the physical parameters of this missile. I know how a Buk missile works, and I know how far it can shoot and what it needs. And all these theories that came up immediately, there were how can I say bullshit without saying bullshit? But it was, you know, it was such a stupid garbage. Everybody who had just the least knowledge of how air defense systems operate or how air warfare takes place. The story of the Sukhoi 25, the Ukrainians. The plane can't fly that high. It has no air-to-air radar. It has no radar at all, actually. It has no weapon system. It is slower than a passenger plane, much slower, especially at high altitude, because it's not meant to fly at high altitude. It's meant to fly 10 meters above the ground. That's where it's supposed to be. It has no weapon to engage the airliner, even if it has self-defense air-to-air missiles, but even they are too weak to actually bridge the gap in altitude, speed and range between an airliner and the Su-25. So the story that the Su-25 might have shot them down is so stupid. That's like you set out the news that a Trabant has won the Monte Carlo trophy. You know, it's like, no, Trabis don't win that. But basically this was my final straw in the Ministry of Defense that I thought, okay, I really have to do something else.
Gustav, let me ask you, you are from the graduate of the Austrian Military Academy, the Maria Theresia Academy. And did you think that there will be such tank battles and urban warfare again in Europe, like it was from August 2014 to Debaltseve and Minsk in February 2015? Did you think we will see such a kind of a military confrontation in Europe ever again?
Actually, yes. I mean, when I grew up, the Balkan Wars were at their peak. Or this was sort of the Balkan Wars, I think, were the most influential youth experience for me when I grew up and had my political mindset made up. Like every Austrians, we have relatives on the Balkans, so especially Croatia and Bosnia. We took some refugees to us at the time. And there were conventional tank battles, not the most prominent one and not large scale. But tanks were heavily used. They were sort of the Croatians lacking tanks and anti-tank capacities was part of why they lost Eastern Slavonia in the first place. This was their main shortfall in 1991 and 1992 when the war geared up, and mustering a lot of tanks and getting them ready to work on top of artillery was why they were then in a stronger position in 1993, 94, and especially 1995, retaking Crimea. So I never had this dismissal attitude that, you know, conventional warfare is dead and we're all gonna be peacekeepers happily ever after, and we will not see interstate war. That was not my recollection of the 90s. That was not what I thought the Russians would think about the security situation in Europe, especially after Putin came to power. This is actually also not what I think the Turks have in mind when they think of their immediate security environment. So no, but yeah, sort of the general trend in people were to believe that we would be doing K4 forever after, and sort of Afghanistan would be the highest intensity warfare stuff we would met. That was, I mean, if you compare it from the military side, if you watch the interwar period between the two world wars, and you had armies like the British Army, the Italian Army, and the French Army that sort of still had extensive colonial realms, they had armed forces at the beginning of the war that were actually really good at policing their colonial possessions. And they were really good at fighting insurgents somewhere in India, Pakistan, somewhere in Libya or in Somalia. The Italian army in Somalia, I mean, you know, we all make jokes about Mussolini, but it was not that bad. You know, it was not. But of course, these armies did pretty bad when they entered war with an army that just didn't care about colonialism and low intensity warfare. And the Wehrmacht pretty much showed them what, you know, combined arms warfare is, and that they're something else but a Somali tribe or some Afghan resistance fighters or whatever. So this kind of rebalancing armies from expeditionary warfare back to conventional warfare and forth is something that is not entirely new. That is sort of the West ran into various circles of this game. And we are now heading back to sort of the same thing. I mean, Berlin is the prime example. They tried to make their army fit for Afghanistan all the time. And once they got there, the Russians invaded Crimea and they had to turn back. And with typical German bureaucracy and sluggishness, they're now still trying to move back from where they were.
Gustav, let me ask you about Minsk too, because in February there was this armistice agreement. Can you explain the international audience why this was not working in a sense? Because continuously we have victims on the Ukrainian side and the war has not really stopped. Why this happened and what's your take on Minsk too?
Thanks a lot. May I just take a sneeze?
Yes, please, please.
Sorry, the cold is catching up. So Minsk, there are a lot of misperceptions about the Minsk agreement, and I just might dig into how it came about. So in February 2015, there was this pocket of Debaltseve that was a very critical battle, not in terms of strategic situation, but in terms of the political situation. This was sort of the pocket of Debaltseve was the Ukrainian attempts to reach in the summer of 2014 to reach the crash site of MH17, because they thought the Russians would sort of try to remove evidence as quick as possible. And the second is this was sort of the second pincer to encircle Donetsk. And of course, then sort of the southern pincer got stopped at Ilovaisk, and the northern pincers stayed in place. And the Ukrainian armed forces wanted to withdraw from there, and especially the field commanders wanted to withdraw and said this is vulnerable. But Poroshenko and sort of decision makers in Kiev said no. In sort of beginning of November 2014, the Russians sort of restructured their forces, started to rotate new, fresh forces into the Donbas, and preparing for the next step of escalation, which would sort of be closing in the pincer in north. The Ukrainians had one of their best sort of freshly reconstructed mechanized brigades in the pocket. So it was an enormously intense battle, also very high Russian casualties at the time. But of course, the Ukrainians were in a position they couldn't win. They also told Kiev that this is unwinnable, the position, and you should, you know, withdraw us to a safe line of defense. Nevertheless, they didn't, and it gave a huge crush to Ukrainian morale. They had lost or shattered their best mechanized force, best mechanized brigades. There was an increased rift, sort of the tensions that had been built up between field commanders and central leadership in Kiev, Ministry of Defense and presidential administration, came to the full open, because this was a conflict that sort of the lower ranks had warned, and they kind of accused Kiev in interfering into stuff that isn't their business, and they're the military professionals in Kiev are just corrupted idiots, etc. So There were fears that the army might fall apart from all of this because of the infighting. Poroshenko was in an enormously weakened position because, of course, the Russians could have advanced further, having sort of shattered the Ukrainian defense and having moved in so large amount of troops. So it was a very tense situation. And in this situation, sort of Merkel, Hollande, Putin, and Poroshenko met in Minsk for negotiations. And the basic skeleton to be negotiated, or the basic skeleton agreement, was the Minsk I agreement, which was signed in September 2014, with 12 almost identical peace points that didn't last. And they in turn were based on Poroshenko's 12-point peace plan that he presented at the presidential election in May. So a lot of controversial points that now the Ukrainians absolutely hate actually came from that peace plan Poroshenko was elected for. This was why there were other sort of more unconciliatory candidates for the presidential election in May 2014, and he with his peace plan that thought autonomy, amnesty, etc., at the time was seen as more conciliatory, and hence elected president, because people kind of wished an end to it but didn't reflect on what it meant. It's a kind of similar situation with Zelensky, but that's another story. However, of course, by February 2014, Poroshenko also had realized that, or everybody has realized that this 12-point peace plan that Poroshenko has won a democratic, legitimate election with were out of time. That they basically built on a minimal consensus between Russia and Ukraine to end this, and that minimal consensus was gone. The Russian demands, Surkov was putting very high demands on constitutional amendments in Ukraine, federalization of the country, etc. And there was ongoing negotiations that were very hard. The Russians didn't want to track back. They were negotiating from a position of military strength. And Poroshenko was very weak because, he couldn't hold the front. So actually, there were, contrary to what is re-narrated now, Merkel actually at 2 points of the negotiations tried, wanted to leave and tried to drag Poroshenko out, and advised him not to sign the agreement because he would sell away the country. And Poroshenko reassured her that the agreement was vague enough to kind of keep the Russians satisfied, but at the end not promising that, or at the end not signing up what the Russians really wanted and succumb to the military pressure, but initiate a process of negotiations how to implement these 13 points. And during this process, we can sort of hammer out the important details and see whether the Russians at a later stage would be willing to sort of come to terms with the fact that they won't get Kiev and that the separatists will not be integrated into Ukraine in a way that they will pose a threat to the sort of sovereignty of the country as an entirety. And that was okay with Merkel, and they basically agreed on that, and that was what the Minsk agreement is about. It's a bad agreement that started a process, and this is why we're still stuck in now. And the problem why we have casualties is because the Russians still see their maximalist demands as Surkov laid them out, and also it's not Surkov now, it's Kozak. They're still the same. So Russia is longing for control of Kiev. Russia wants to have the separatist entities as they are, and not as entities under Ukrainian law, as it is stipulated in the Minsk agreement, to be integrated in Ukraine in a way of amending the Ukrainian constitution that would erode and replace Ukraine's right to self-determine its own political affairs by a kind of quasi-colonial say of Russia, which no Ukrainian president, whether Zelensky or Poroshenko or whomever Ukraine is going to elect as president, will ever accept. And the Russians still think that turning up and down sort of the military pressure in the Donbass is a prime mean to kind of push Ukraine towards concessions. And whenever they feel that the Ukrainians are not dancing to their music and not doing what they really want, they start to escalate in one form or the other. Which is the same what we have seen in spring. There was last summer, basically, direct talks between Kozak and Yermak set towards certain points, and Kozak thought he would push Yermak into further concessions. And actually, Yermak personally was rather inclined to. This was especially about recognizing the DNR and LNR as with their current political leaders as legitimate negotiation counterparts. And Yermak seemed to have been inclined towards doing so, but it proved to be a domestic policy bomb for Zelensky, so Zelensky stopped it, which made Yermak mad, and the Russians sort of wondered what was going on. They're notoriously bad at reading Ukrainian domestic politics, so they thought this was sort of the new Biden administration or some hidden CIA interference that pushed the Ukrainians towards a more nationalistic line, which of course is total bullshit. It's the same Ukrainian negotiation position we have witnessed for the whole past 6 years. And they thought that sort of now Biden might sort of alter the stakes, seek a new agreement, replace Minsk by a format the US is in, and they need to escalate in order to show the world that they are still master of the process, and that no diplomatic format can be changed without Russian consensus. And yeah, that's why they did this big military war scale.
Gustav, let me ask you about your recent report. Together with Carl Bildt and Nico Popescu, you have published now, 7 years later, a report called Push Back, Contain and Engage Russia. So how to push back, how to engage, how to contain? What's your take on our Russian policy 7 years into the Donbass war?
Yes, so the paper came about after the Borrell visit. So we have been working behind the scenes on ideas on all of these issues before. So there's one paper, the Security Compact, how to mend security partnerships with the association countries, so Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, which is sort of basically the more detailed skeleton about the contain part. Or at least in the eastern neighborhood, we have been informally working, also trying to find out what actually is there to engage and what needs to be done on the containment part. And now after Borrell made this slogan, this was his sort of an EAS official line that sort of now Russia has changed so fundamentally. We cannot continue with sort of the policies we had before. We need to strengthen and more strategically align our policies towards Russia. And he made set up these terms: contain, engage, and pushback. And we thought that it would be a good idea to operationalize this, because the problem is Brussels speeches, they're always about nice words like strategic Europe, or before that it was strategic autonomy. And now sort of pushback, engage, and contain, but there is never a detailed debate. And so, okay, so now practically, what are we going to do about it? What's in there? What does it mean for us? What's the administrative and steps we have to take? The new policies, the new money we need to spend or not spend. That we need to do in order not just to make this a Sunday speech and make sound good on a podcast, but to kind of get policies on the ground. And sort of we did together these sort of pieces and parcels and framed them into a coherent narrative, so that it would give policymakers an idea and kind of on which avenues to go along. So basically, it's about, first of all, getting a high grade of resilience against Russian obstruction and covert operations in Europe, to kind of negotiate from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness, where the other side knows your negotiating positions, you're kind of appearing to be begging Russia for consensus, but rather to have capabilities, policies, and a certain amount of resilience in place that make you appear stronger, and you're not a demandeur to Moscow, but you kind of put your strategic vision on the table, and the Russians have to deal with it, not having a kind of mushy EU you can try to box into in terms to shape its form. The engagement part is sort of, once you kind of, we've seen with Navalny that the government is unaccountable and you shouldn't engage with government structures itself. How do you reach out to the other Russia that there still is? Because also Navalny and the protests showed that, you know, not all are happy FSB warmongers who try to poison enemies of the state abroad and wag war on their neighbors. There's still Russia there as well, and you should kind of stay in touch with it. The problem is, of course, that the level of repression and the level of paranoia and of the Russian security forces and clamping down civil society and trying to suppress these organizations and even use this sort of Western support, be it verbal or monetary wise, as a pretext to crush organizations that they don't like. Makes this very difficult to operationalize. So basically we are switching almost to a Belarus model, where you kind of support organizations by bringing people to Europe, getting them to know Europe, or educating them in European institutions, and basically with this kind of engagement hope to improve the image of Europe in Russia and make the Russians aware that a different future for them is also possible. That I have to say almost worked with regard to Belarus. I mean, a lot of the protest movements, sort of the hardcore of the protest movements, are young people who, because of the outreach policy that Lukashenko embarked on after 2011 towards the EU, at one or the other place actually got to know the West and started to think, well, actually Belarus could work the same way if we had a different president. And yeah, I mean, the rest is history. But
Gustav, let me ask you, in your report, you are talking about visa facilitation for Russians as a kind of engagement tool. You are short of recommending visa-free travel for the Russians, but let me understand, you are arguing that we should make an offer to the Russian middle class, and that we are open and we are friendly, and maybe also give visa freedom to the Russians.
Well, visa freedom, the problem is, that relates to my next speaking engagement, intelligence cooperation with the Americans. The problem, visa freedom, is something that you can't give out for sort of political goodwill. It requires an enormous amount of mutual recognition of administrative acts, starting from personal registers who need to be compatible, biometric passports, of course, a mutual recognition of verdicts, arrest warrants, etc. Because once you travel visa-free, the amount of travel, the free travel will not only be used by educated, nice students who are curious about the West and want to see Europe, which are, of course, 99% of the Russians that visit Europe, but there is the 1% which are spies and criminals. They make use of this too, and they create, as we have seen in Salisbury, as we have seen in Czech Republic, as we have seen in Bulgaria, it's not a minor problem that they create and how they use the freedom and spaces within the union. So the problem is all these technical requirements on exchanging of data, exchanging of registers, of seriousness of the other administrative parts. They're not for nothing, and this is why this also takes so long with, for example, Ukraine or Georgia. It's not because we don't like the Ukrainians or we don't like the Georgians. It's because of getting their Ministry of Interior reforms to the point you can really plug them into the European system. That took some time. But of course, with Russia, I mean, do you want to have FSB arrest warrants to be a legal, applicable document in Europe? I mean, you know, with all due respect to poor Russian civil society actors, you know, their legal and rule of law barriers that make visa liberalization something that is completely impossible. And I'm sorry to say that it sounds like a great idea, but it isn't. So visa facilitation is something that is possible because it also gives our consulates and embassies more freedom to select candidates to come and not. And if the problem is this needs to be coupled with increased resilience. So intelligence cooperation needs to be strengthened. The data exchange under Schengen is completely insufficient to handle this job. But if we do our own domestic policy on internal security and counterintelligence right, a visa facilitation program is the right tool to really engage with interested young Russians, to bring them to the West, to access them to proper education, proper history, etc. And at least mitigating the negative effects. If we get our own act together with at point the EU really needs to do, we can do that.
Gustav, let me ask you about the Council of Europe readmission process in 2019, when the voting rights of the Russian Federation as a part of an engagement of Europe was reinstated. Was it successful? And what's your take on Council of Europe membership of Russia?
So on Council of Europe membership of Russia, I'm enormously skeptical. So the advocates of this say it's the only way for Russian civil society to gain some point of accountability on the state, and even sort of if the Russian state doesn't set people free, it at least sort of financially compensates political prisoners for it. The problem is, they have not taken into account the constitutional changes that happened in the meantime, that basically declare Council of Europe and European Court of Human Rights verdicts void and invalid in Russia, and that match the current wave of repression. That was foreseeable. I mean, the policies, the laws, the academic decrees, they were all already out there, being conceived, being drafted, or when the readmission process was started. And sort of then the Russia watchers like me had Twitter fights with the Russian engagers, like and German MPs and French diplomats that pushed for readmitting Russia, because we've had, well, you're crazy. It will not protect anybody, but Russia will have access to voting rights and try to troll and destroy the Council of Europe in its effectiveness as much as it can. And basically this is what we're seeing now. So Russia in the Council of Europe, we have an increasing faction of authoritarian states, which is unfortunately not only Russia, but it's countries like Azerbaijan or Turkey, for instance, that try to dilute the whole human rights accountable government agenda as much as possible, try to water down any decision as much as possible, try to ignore or water down any verdict that would compel states to correct laws or correct administrative decrees as much as possible. And the more you strengthen this fraction in the Council of Europe, the more problematic it is to advance sort of and to put pressure on states where they actually have leverage on. And I mean, I had zero illusions that Council of Europe membership would change a bit in Russia, and it didn't, and it doesn't. But the problem is the Council of Europe still counts for countries who, for example, want to join the European Union, like Bosnia, like Kosovo, like Montenegro, like North Macedonia, like Ukraine, like Moldova, where the Council of Europe, expert commissions from the Council of Europe are involved in judicial reform issues, in police reform issues, in consultative processes when it comes to redrafting constitutional processes, judiciary reform, police reform, prosecutor reform, etc. These are all enormously important steps for these small countries. Geopolitically, of course not, but this is for a citizen of Bosnia to have a more or less accountable court system is enormously important. And here, sort of the watering down policy of Russia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, etc., is enormously harmful because it just prevents that. The Council of Europe, the European Union has outsourced a lot of its watchdog function for rule of law applications to the Council of Europe. A lot of EU accession processes, a lot of EU criteria depend on the Council of Europe's judgments on domestic policies and constitutional arrangements in these countries. So it's deeply non-trivial for European affairs to have a Council of Europe that works. Either the EU starts to create its own bodies for this and kind of declares the Council of Europe dead. If they want to do that, they can sort of have Russia rejoin with full rights and have all these sort of turf wars that go on and nonsense battles. But if you want to have this as functioning technically valid instrument to enforce rule of law and accountable government in Europe, you have to lock the Russians out.
Gustav, let me ask you about this 2019 decision to readmit the voting rights. Should it be reconsidered in the light of the Navalny case, but also in the light of human rights abuses against Crimean Tatars living in annexed Crimea? Should it be reconsidered?
Of course, of course. And actually there is a legal title. So in the Navalny case, the verdict against Navalny was declared by the European Court for Human Rights as a purely political verdict that is void and shall not be executed. Russia, of course, ignores this happily. But actually, we could now set sort of the inner measures of the Council of Europe to deal with a non-compliant state. Russia is a non-compliant state under the European Charter for Human Rights, and it's a non-compliant state to the verdicts of the European Court for Human Rights. So we need to deal it accordingly, and we need to start also to show to Russia that we are actually serious about all these declarations and charters we always talk about, to act and to enact the measures that legally are applicable to them. And yes, Crimean Tatars is sort of the next case. I think there are several cases pending in Strasbourg, and of course they will produce verdicts that we can roughly imagine because the court is functional. So then again, I think Russia will ignore them, and we have a non-compliant Russian Federation.
Gustav, let me ask you about the recent military buildup of the Russian Federation at the Ukrainian-Russian border. It was over 100,000 soldiers, I read. How dangerous that was, why it was undertaken, and is there still danger at the moment?
Yeah, so actually funny, Borrell was attacked because he said there are 150,000 soldiers. I think on 29th or 30th of April, Shoigu said 300,000 soldiers have been part in the readiness drill. I think that number is exaggerated, but because it also depends on how you count it. Do you only ground forces, air forces, logistical forces, command structures, etc. So no. To be honest, I mean, a lot of experts in the West laughed this and said, this is just brinkmanship and the Russians were never going to do something. The military buildup, of course, was not poised for a full-scale war invasion of Ukraine. For this, if you compare it to, for example, 2014, in 2014, the Russian forces had a force ratio from sort of pure military force towards, then it was called Ministry of Interior, in the respective operative maneuver groups that rated from 3 to 1 to 1 to 1. So in some operative maneuver groups, there were 3 times more soldiers than Ministry of Interior groups. In some, there were actually as many Ministry of Interior troops as there were regular Russian soldiers. that at the time was an indication that they are hoping for invasion and occupation, because you need the Ministry of Interior. Now it's the Russian National Guard. It was rebranded in 2016 to run an occupation regime, to suppress dissidents, to sort of arrest all Ukrainians who resist Russian occupation. What they do in Crimea, to lock people up and beat them. In this military buildup, there were very, very few National Guard soldiers. They had some protection service deployed around the Crimean Bridge and some bases, makeshift bases, but it was very sketchy. There was no big Russian National Guard deployment around. So we could say, okay, it's not full invasion and occupation of the entire country. But any form of escalation, like we have seen in Debaltseve in 2015, to kind of pick a vulnerable spot on the front, shatter the Ukrainian defenses, show them that sort of Russia is the master of military escalation. That was still very possible. And all the military buildup around Ukraine, again, was tying down forces. The Ukrainians couldn't send all reserves to the Donbas if needed there, because they still had to prepare for the case that Russia might do something on other fronts as well, where it has soldiers close by. So it was a very dangerous situation. And also on live ammunition. I mean, we saw the Russians carrying around live ammunition with their troops. We then saw that by the end of April, they started to fire, by sort of mid-end April, they started to do live fire exercises in Crimea and shoot this live ammunition. But how, in the beginning of April, that was really unsettling to see the Russians not only move troops and pipelines to supply big armored formations, but also to start to ship tank and artillery rounds to them. What for? I mean, the danger is not completely over. There's some forces haven't really withdrawn. The 41st Army in the north is still in field camps and will probably stay there at least till autumn. Also, the 56th Assault Brigade will probably permanently be redeployed to Crimea. So the Sea of Azov is still blocked. Ukrainian ships can't enter and exit it, which particularly for Mariupol is a very dire situation, because the city, all the industrial enterprises, also the agriculture happening basically around there in the western Donbas is dependent on the port of Mariupol to export this stuff. It's export-oriented industries and it's export-oriented agriculture. And the train juncture of the railway system was Donetsk for the region. So that of course is gone now. So if you do not have a railway system that can transport mass goods, it's really hard to timely export mass goods like grain. You can't store grain for 2 years till the things die down. You know, corn or whatever. It needs to be, once it's harvested, it needs to be exported. So that is a particularly bad situation economically and politically, of course, for this region that still remains to be resolved.
Gustav, the recently elected American president, Mr. Biden, he made an interview where he referred to Mr. Putin as a killer. And also the Russians have responded in putting out a list of hostile states, including, I think, 6 or 7 European and NATO member states, from the Czech Republic, Baltic to Bulgaria. What's your take on the future, on the immediate future, the next half year of European, NATO and Russian relation? Where do you think we are heading? To a confrontation, to some détente? What is your take?
No, we're in a confrontation, and these measures are just part of that confrontation. And the confrontation, I think, will just continue as basically as it was. There will be smaller ups and downs, but nothing strategically will change. Putin is in a confrontational mindset. He thinks the West, and particularly the US, is out there to get him and to destroy Russia. This is the old conspiracy-minded FSB/KGB mindset, and he's too old to change his mind. You know, you can. A lot of people change ideology during their lifetime, but usually they change this from the year, you know, from being a student to getting into professional life. That is when ideological change usually happens, not when you're in Putin's age group. He's increasingly relying on the intelligence services to not only provide him with intelligence, but sort of to provide him also with political analysis, to judge world affairs, to propose policy recommendations in foreign policy and other issues. So we have the intelligence services are increasingly the policy drivers in the Russian Federation, which is bad news, and which means that all other policy areas we usually used to deal with the Russians are now overlaid by security concerns and by paranoia and by fear and by confrontational thinking, which I think will even see the remaining pockets of confrontation, of cooperation between Russia and the West, like the Arctic, shrink in the coming years, and it will only get worse. Where it will depart from there, let's see. For me as a military analyst, the main purpose of NATO and the West is now to not have any of these confrontations to spill over into full-fledged war. If we can achieve that, of course, nobody will thank us for having prevented a war that never did start. But during the Cold War, NATO did a great job preventing a war that never started, but that could have started in a second if NATO weren't there. To have the kind of same ungrateful and unspectacular end to this round of confrontation. If we achieve that, I'm perfectly happy, because it will be tough enough. This is also something sort of from my life curve that I learned: never take peace and stability and rule of law for granted. It needs to be won every second.
Gustav, the main area of confrontation then will be the so-called Eastern Partnership countries, where you are directly responsible in the Council for Foreign Relations. Let's discuss first of all Ukraine, how you see it. Is there a chance for Ukraine, NATO and EU accession, and should that be happening?
Well, the question is, should that be happening, is a different one than will that be happening. So first, on EU accession, I think this is the least likely in the immediate future. First, we have, particularly in Western Europe, some states who are enormously reluctant to further enlargements. Sort of the most outspoken them, of course, are France and the Netherlands, but there are others as well who think that even the past enlargement rounds were a step too much, and now we kind of own all these kleptocratic, not really stable democracies. The way how Hungary and Poland developed did really a bad favor to all enlargement arguments, because people say, now look, they joined and then they turned into some kind of hybrid systems that would never have been allowed to join the EU. And that's true. And the internal mechanisms of the EU to deal with this kind of danger are all insufficient, and everybody knows that. Even those who would wish to have an enlargement know that they're insufficient. So we need to see a deep EU reform before a major, larger enlargement. We also need to see deeper reform in Ukraine or Georgia. In Georgia, the sort of the pace of state capture by Georgian Dream is just astonishing. And it's what we have seen in Romania and Bulgaria on steroids. I'm not now making the case for Saakashvili. He has his own problems on his own kind, but the problem is that, you know, that sort of you have a party taking government and presidency and basically then doing whatever it wants with state institutions. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And in Ukraine, we still have a lot of reforms that have started on paper only, but in practice are very difficult to implement, and sort of to get Ukraine to the pace where it can access, or Moldova to really access the Union on a serious basis. This is still a very, very, very long road. I mean, I'd wish that at least we would say, look, if you complete this road, and if you do all your homework, you will not put political obstacles in your way. I would be happy if it would say that to the Ukrainians openly, but we don't, unfortunately. But it wouldn't change a thing of the fact that sort of the miles to go on the reforms are still enormously long. On NATO accession, this would of course be easier because it's not that demandful in terms of democratic government, of rule of law. Still, of course, the same principal skepticism towards yet unconsolidated countries applies, but it would be in practical terms easier. Also in Ukraine's case particularly, but also in Georgia's case, the pace of reforms that we have seen in the defense sector is much better than the pace of reforms in other civilian sectors. So, I mean, the Georgians have, at least on paper, from their defense administrative posture, they've really tidied up their Ministry of Defense. There's still, you can debate how effective their own armed forces is in terms of defending the country, but in terms of the bureaucratic reforms and rule of law in the armed forces, they've done a great job. The Ukrainians have created a pretty effective ground force, not yet air force, but and navy, but the ground force, skipping a lot of the paperwork in Kiev, to be honest. So on purely legal reform assessment, Ukraine is much worse than Georgia in practical terms. You know, in the fighting punch of the armed forces, I'd bet on the Ukrainians if you pitch them against the Georgians. So one of the NATO criteria, I mean, they're also in NATO, there's sort of big criteria, and when a country has an access, and the first is the free choice of the people. So there needs to be a referendum, and it needs to be a sort of a democratic choice that this country wants to join it. That's not a problem for either one of for maybe except Moldova, it's not a problem for these countries. Then there's sort of a democratic rule of law and a civilian control of the armed forces. Here we were fishy, but in Georgia we are on a good track, and in Ukraine we are getting better. And then is sort of the third criteria, and that's sort of the fishy one, is that the accession of a further member of NATO needs to strengthen the alliance instead of weakening it. It needs to increase its security instead of creating additional burdens. And this third criteria, of course, is something that now skeptical countries towards enlargement can happily ride on, because it was during the 2000s when we had the big enlargement, this was kind of, yeah, they contribute to Iraq and Afghanistan, so it's a contribution, let's do this. Nobody thought about defending the Baltic countries or Romania or Bulgaria against the Russian invasion. That was not what security at the time meant for most people. The problem, of course, now with Georgia and Ukraine, it obviously does that. And if you look at Georgian geography, how far they are away, what the lines of communications were, what the disposal of forces that you have, and if you make a kind of force time calculation, which forces, which party can get there at what time to enact, it's an enormous headache for defense planners to, in case of the point, defend Georgia. And in Ukraine, you can make the case, well, they're defending themselves quite effectively since 2014. But of course, if we take the sort of a full-fledged Russian invasion, including the Russian Air Force, of course, things would look different than the war in Donbass we are having now. So in these both cases, of course, this is a big angle that the skeptics on enlargement have to say, well, it can't happen now. Now, to leave a more happy note, I see, at least in France, not the discussion on enlargement necessarily, but the discussion on sort of what kind of a problem the war in Ukraine is to European security shifting. From this kind of Macron appeasement, we have just misunderstood the Russians, like make a deal with them and then we're all happy, to a kind of assessing the real destabilizing potential of the Kremlin and Russia. Basically and they're starting to track back on their outreach and happy appeasement agenda, slowly but still. I just hope sort of Macron politically survives his own learning process, which is the other risk, because you might get a new French president, maybe even a female president, which will immediately start at the same appeasement process. We sort of, the French now learned that it's ineffective. but nevertheless, so there is movement in Europe. And I would be happy if Ukraine and Georgia don't waste the time until there is a sufficient movement in Europe, not by just sort of demanding accession and talk about it, but by really pushing reforms to, you know, to really not give any arguments to the delayers and deferrers and appeasers in Europe for not admitting them. There is enough to be done to strengthen the defense capacities of both countries. And actually, you have within NATO, of course, now with Biden, particularly in Washington, but also in several European countries, administrations that are really willing to help these countries getting better on defense. And let's build and use every opportunity that there is now, that things like the European peace facility that is integrating, that will also have some money for the Eastern Partnership to get to help military reform and capacity building, from cybersecurity down to military education, whatever there is that we can do that to make them more secure and help them out in the immediate future they have. And on the rest, well, let's see. That's a debate for the future. We won't stop fighting, but you know, victory is not around the corner.
Gustav, because the EU has opened PESCO defense integration also for non-EU members. Is it an option for Ukraine, which has a massive defense industry, to also integrate in the European defense sector, industrial defense sector?
Well, theoretically, yes. Practically, to a very limited extent. So theoretically, yes, they can apply. The problem is that in Europe, it gets enormously fishy once you start to touch the sort of the core turf of Europe's own defense industry. And the problem is Europe's own, because we so desperately underspend on defense in Europe, our own defense industry in many countries are under enormous pressure to rationalize and to cut, and they kind of depend on the European markets to help them out to survive. And there's a lot of political pressure to do so. The problem with the Ukrainian defense sector is that it offers a lot of products that we have already in Europe. And hence they're seen by many countries as just peer competitors. Let's take, for example, transport aircraft. The Ukrainian Antonov 70, which is a good plane, no problem with that. But it's, in terms of capabilities, roughly exactly the same as the Airbus A400. So setting up something that would allow the Ukrainians to better sell the Antonov 70 in Europe will make stiff resistance with any of the Airbus hosting countries, because they want to sell their stuff. And we can basically dial that through all brackets of defense equipment that the Ukrainians have. You will find an equivalent in Europe. So in practical terms here, in defense industry terms, the Ukrainians will go with the Turks for practical reasons. The Turks don't have what the Ukrainians can offer and are willing to pay. And the Ukrainians need every country that pays for stuff that they can get to have their defense sector surviving. So all these geopolitical blah blah you hear now about Erdogan, Ukraine cooperation and geopolitical contest against Russia, that's all bullshit. That is pure industrial needs. The Turks are under embargo from Europe, from Canada, and to some extent from the US after the S-400 and the episode in northern Syria against the Kurds. They can't get key items they need for their own defense products, such as drones, tanks, aircraft, etc. And the Ukrainians can manufacture that, and the Turks are willing to pay every price to get it. So it's practical for Kiev to say yes to that, and they get a bunch of drones on top. But that's, you know, there is a bit of possibility. The Ukrainians do that with the Poles together. Because the Poles and the Czechs have a defense industry that is specialized in modernizing former Soviet equipment with better night vision, communication devices, etc. Here they're actually already teaming up with enterprises that have experienced in NATO-izing Soviet stuff. In Poland, particularly Poland is the strongest one, but Czech Republic, Slovakia also have some capabilities. And produce some things in Ukraine in cooperation with particularly Poland, but also other countries. This is, I think, a niche where where defense cooperation with Ukraine can be very fruitful. And I wish the Commission would put a bit more money into that bracket, because the problem is not only the Ukrainians have the problem of modernizing Soviet Lega equipment, also our own NATO allies, who are sort of the closest neighbors to Russia and most immediately endangered by any kind of military operations, like Poland, like Bulgaria, like Romania across Crimea in the Black Sea. They also handle a lot of Soviet equipment and don't have the money to just overnight switch to fancy German, French, American stuff. So for the sake of our own security, we should sort of tap the Ukrainian knowledge that is there in modernizing this kind of stuff, combine this with our own technological skills to get a good common output.
Gustav, let me ask you about Moldova. We have on the 11th of July, we have the early parliamentary election. And my question now, do you think that there will be a pro-European victory of pro-European political forces? And do you think that EU will react accordingly and award them with EU potential candidate status, the same status like Kosovo and Bosnia have currently?
I wish they would. So the chances for a pro-European, or I have to say pro-European in the Moldovan context, is actually not the appropriate word. It's a pro-accountable governance reform coalition that also is pro-European, because Filat also tried to prospect himself. Plahotniuc also labeled himself pro-European. Well, yeah. But of course it's Sandu's party, and they want to push forward reforms, and the likelihood of them winning is there. It will be very tight, so it will boil down to basically the electoral arithmetic, but she might gain a majority of seats in the Moldovan parliament, basically because the previous forces have exhorted them. I mean, Plahotniuk's party is just Plahotniuk. After the banking scandal, everybody knows that they're just plain corrupt and how he behaves thereafter. And Dodon still holding a tight grip on the Socialist Party. He now met with Lukashenko. So if the Socialist Party would put somebody else up, then Dodon, probably they would have higher chances, but it's Dodon's party now. Sorry. So basically that is also giving an extra boost to Maya Sandu, and they have a chance of winning. How quickly the EU will react and make according offers, I don't know. Usually the EU is very sluggish in reacting to this kind of chances and moments, and basically watch the news and wait and see till new ministers come in and then slowly start to reach out to them. It's the completely wrong approach. After such a complete turnover in forces, you need to immediately approach the new ministers, immediately propose an agenda to them, because usually they also need a lot of time to get a grip on their own ministry. And in that time, sort of the kind of vested interests or established forces try to poke the minister, see where he has his interests, and try to put their agenda in the words of what the minister likes, and try to kind of subvert this agenda of reforms with their own diluting issues. And this for the oligarchic forces, for the vested interest, usually is like a 3-4 month learning process. And EU has a 6 month to 1 year learning process how to work with the new minister. If we could get quicker than the corrupt guys, we'd have an enormous competitive advantage, but we don't. And we've seen that all over with new Ukrainian governments, with new Georgian governments, with new Moldovan governments. It's always the bloody bastards are always quicker than us. It's such a shame, but it's yeah.
Maybe
so let's hope, fingers crossed, to be a bit better next time.
It's the third time the Moldovans are trying to join Europe. Maybe we have learned this time. Let me ask you about the next war. Unfortunately, in the area of responsibility, there was another war in 2020, the Armenian-Azerbaijan war. What's your take on that? Why did it suddenly happen? Were you surprised? And what's your take on this war?
On this, I was fairly surprised, especially on the sort of decisiveness of the outcome. I have to say, the Nagorno-Karabakh war is the only war that I had rather limited knowledge and interest about, for the reason that it's the only post-Soviet conflict that is original. That if I take a guy from Donetsk and a guy from Kiev, I'd put them in a dark room and reopen the room after 3 hours, they would be drunk together singing. But if I take an Armenian and an Azeri and put them to a dark room and come back after 3 hours, both would be dead. These are the only two ethnical groups in the post-Soviet space that really truly like to kill each other, and so I thought this conflict was unsolvable anyway, because the other one is just basically in how to box one party out of the game, to use this as a geopolitical leverage, which is a different game than having two ethnic groups that really hate each other trying to reconcile them. It's a total policy-wise and strategic-wise a totally different affair. So said that, I was sloppy. There were warning signs. We had a confrontation in May. We had a little war in 2016. We had the sort of the Turkish exercises in Azerbaijan, rehearsing exactly what was going on then from September onwards, starting by the end of June. We had the Kafkas 2020, heavily redesigned from what it used to be, towards a different kind of more local, more defensive maneuver. I actually thought at the time, I've reread my reports now for what I thought about Kafkas 2020, that this was due to Belarus, due to Lukashenko, the 9th of August election. They had also maneuvers in Kaliningrad at the time. They had maneuvers on the border with Belarus. I thought that the Russians have downscaled and changed the character of Kafkas 2020 because of Belarus. It seemed logic to me. Well, it wasn't. Belarus had nothing to do with it. It was that they knew what the Turks are going to do. They explicitly maneuvered in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They explicitly trained defending yourself against an attacking blue party that would heavily rely on drones for advancing their offense, and to protect a proxy in the Caucasian neighborhood from such an offensive. So they put the warning sign up to the Turks. Look, we know what you are going to do, and remember that we are there, and if necessary, would be there to stop it. Of course, Russia had an interest to destabilize Pashinyan. Russia also had an interest in increasing its weight in the conflict mediation. They tried so diplomatically by proposing the Lavrov plan, and the Armenians and Pashinyan particularly said no to that, which on top angered the Russians. And if I believe my Turkish sources, and I really do believe my Turkish sources, Erdogan and Putin had a call over this war to and Putin reassured Erdogan that as long as the Azeris would only reconquer those territories that Armenia would have to seize under the Lavrov plan, Russia will do nothing about it. And that was sort of the consent on which Turkey and Azerbaijan basically launched their offensive. And if you see that the Russian reactions, they were like the Europeans, hands off, and we call all parties to cease fire, and all these soft blah blah, up until the Battle of Shusha, because that was part of Nagorno-Karabakh proper. That was not part of the territories that the Russians have granted the Azeris to intervene. And immediately the Russians set out an ultimatum and deployed peacekeepers. So you see them snap overnight from their kind of European attitude of being fluffy to the usual Russian reaction of immediately sending troops. That confirms the hypothesis and that what the Turks said, that they had a green light for this. Yeah.
Armenia is in the Collective Security Treaty Organization in the anti-NATO. Do you think it will stay in that defense alliance?
It will have to. I mean, the CSTO only protects Armenia proper and not Nagorno-Karabakh. But effectively, everybody knows that Armenian identity and their heart and blood is with Nagorno-Karabakh as well. But the Russians have a legal excuse not to fight over it. But still, the problem is that the Armenians are in a position where they fear that Turkey would join a war with Azerbaijan, and together they would kind of erase Armenia from the political map. And if you saw Aliyev's rhetoric and how he's dealing with political prisoners and the war memorial, I think the Armenian paranoia is justified. And Erdogan has not given the Armenians any kind of reassurance that he would not join up the fight. The way how he played this propaganda-wise as his own victory in Turkey, how much it galvanized nationalist movements in Turkey. The Armenians have no other chance than to seek for an external balancer to have a military reassurance. They now, of course, come to terms with the consequences of this, is that it's sort of the space for Armenia to have other economic ties and relations with the Europeans, to bring criminal oligarchs to court, which harms Russian interests, to have a more democratic system than the rest of the Russian space, to have more rule of law and a bit more freedoms for its citizens. All that basically is now on the disposal. Russia is not demanding a new geopolitical orientation, they demand domestic policy control. This is why they also feed the anti-Pashinyan opposition and kind of use the war as an external leverage to get to crush it. Which they are not yet there, but that's what they're working on.
On Azerbaijan, you see a chance for a more democratic Azerbaijan in the coming years?
Not in the immediate future. I still hope to see it sometimes, but not under this regime. And the regime is, with the victory now in place, they have been drumbeating this up and down the road. I think also sort of the unconciliatory note towards Armenia and the dreams of conquering Yerevan, etc. This is basically put up by Aliyev because this nationalism and hatred towards Armenia was such a convenient tool to unite society behind a common enemy and not have any question asked about how Aliyev rules Azerbaijan itself. So I fear this will continue and much better. And Aliyev, sort of amongst all the dictators, he is one of the youngest. So unfortunately, by biological life expectancy, we will have this problem for the time to come, and then let's see what's going on next. But also, suppression has kicked into gear long before. Azerbaijan, in many ways, was a front runner in suppression together with Belarus. So they have ample of experience how to do that. They have, in many cases, also Moscow's and Ankara's support in doing this. Unfortunately.
You're talking about Belarus, the oldest dictator we have. I was already protesting in '95 against Lukashenko. It was not very effective. He's still around. So what's your take now to this courageous women of Belarus who are protesting in the streets for half a year now? And what's your perspective on Belarus?
To my personal take, I think that the situation is less stable than we think it might be. I mean, Lukashenko is fighting a two-front war for survival. One is against his own population, which is for him the most comfortable ones because he can rely on his security forces in suppressing and fighting them. And he's now basically, all he does is caring for the well-being of the security forces and them being protected. And it's kind of a Venezuelan scenario, keep the police happy and make them beat the shit out of the opposition. The other front war is, of course, that with Russia, who wants to have a deep integration, which is what Lukashenko doesn't want. And on this, we had, I mean, he's dragging his feet and he does not want to move an inch. He's constantly bombarded from Moscow with demands for fiscal integration, for tax integration, for administrative integrations. And he's only giving in very narrow bits in very unimportant policy areas where he can basically afford some kind of deeper integration. And he is in many ways already deeply integrated into the Russian security field. So the Russians want to set up kind of proxy organizations. They want to divert power from the presidency towards the parliament and towards other bodies in the Belarusian state, like the Security Council, where they have proxies, intelligence officers, oligarchic parties, etc., that run the affairs in order not to be dependent on Lukashenko as a person when dealing with Belarus, in order to have sort of alternative sources of power, which they can play against each other if they want to control Belarus. And Lukashenko is fighting all he can to preserve the ultimate and true monopoly of power in all affairs. There are different guesses on how this will end. So they're both in Minsk and Moscow. There are people who believe Lukashenko already cut the curve. There are sufficient protesters in jail or have fled abroad. So the domestic situation is stable enough for him to not give an inch to the Russians. There are people, especially in Moscow, say no, the front is still more volatile because the economic sanctions also now the Americans have kicked in that will hit Belarus hard, and it's getting increasingly costly, and Russia has to pay all the bills anyway, and Russia will demand this. And if Russia turns down the tap for money and security assistance, Lukashenko will hang in the cold, and he will have to crawl back to Russia and beg for pardon. So the thing is now I actually thought that that Putin would sort of alter the stake and threaten Lukashenko much deeper. I think 2 weeks ago now, when he had this the Federal Assembly speech and the Federal Council called in for decision making, ultimately decided on nothing important. But I thought, that he would sort of put out his agenda for the Union state to put Lukashenko under pressure and say, well, this is my demands, and if nothing follows from that, I will do something bad to you. But for the time being, so there's no movement. So the Russians don't dare to really threaten Lukashenko, and Lukashenko doesn't really dare to change and to move and to give in. However, sort of both might actually see things change on the ground. So economically, Belarus is heading to, and societally, towards Venezuela, an economically bankrupt, brutal regime. This might also change the loyalty of some ballast forces within Minsk. If this goes down, you might have forces to reconsider their loyalty to Lukashenko. You might have, considering the Russians, that this is too expensive to so a lot of that will depend on short-term perceptions, how they see the chances of any operations. For the time being, the Russians seem to not want to take any risk with regard to Belarus, but they might get more confident. We will see. This will be an enormously tricky theater.
Gustav, we have 6 countries in the Eastern Partnership. That's the EU policy for the whole region between the EU and Russia. And they are very different countries. We have Belarus, Venezuela style. We have Armenia and Belarus in the CSTO. We have Azerbaijan, which is not a democracy and an ally of whatever. And it's in the non-aligned movement. And we have 3 countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, which are DCFTA countries, pro-European, pro-NATO. They want to reform. They are not perfect. Why do we have the same policy for all 6 countries? And this is not time to change the Eastern Partnership in some way after 11 years?
Well, actually, there are different policies for each of them, because you have the 3 DCFTA countries who have a very different or who have a very special agenda for themselves. Whether it's really useful to meet with Lukashenko and Aliyev on top of that is a thing that needs to be debated. The common framework, things that you can do with all 6 is almost nil. So this is some offers to civil society. Not even corona vaccination works with all of them, because Lukashenko doesn't take Western vaccines. Azerbaijan does, they're at least flexible on this, and but sort of this, of course, it's minimal. It was created back then. Actually, Russia was invited to join the Eastern Neighborhood Partnership long time ago, but it from the very start said it had zero interest in the whole format. But the original idea of making this as exclusive as it is to underpin the point of free choice. Sort of that is sort of the offer to all countries, and they can pick it up or not pick it up. But the EU themselves will not declare any neighbor to kind of be ineligible or unworthy. Things in Belarus might change, things in Azerbaijan might change, and once things change, you then have a kind of framework where Azerbaijan or Belarus might climb up the ladder if they want. But it's up to them, not up to us, to decide on their future. I think this basic signal is still valid. Although we are marching through very dark times in both of these countries. I think it's especially valid with regard to Armenia, which is still fighting for survival on many fronts. How much you really need to make a brimborium and trara to kind of keep this signal alive, and whether these summits do well now, they are suspended to online formats anyway. That's a thing you really can discuss, but this is a thing that, that's more up to diplomatic taste, which I'm notoriously bad at judging, rather than policy substance.
On defense policy, let me ask you one question, because as an Austrian, you know very well the Balkan countries. You know also now in your function with the ECFR, you know very much the Eastern Partnership. And the idea is basically that 2003 was created the Adriatic Charter as the successor organization of the Vilnius Charter, which was the pre-grouping of the US Defense Department to bring countries closer to NATO. And this Adriatic Charter works, and there is 5 members, the Americans and the Balkan countries. Also, Kosovo, Serbia is observer countries. My question now, is it an idea to invite Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia to be also observer countries in the Adriatic Charter and work closer on upgrading their defense mechanism in the framework of the Southeastern European countries?
Observer status, I think, would be a good idea, would be feasible. Whether something more is actually practical and feasible, I don't know. There are bilateral with NATO, with regard to NATO, there are bilateral frameworks, which there is no overarching sort of house with Ukraine and Georgia, but there are bilateral frameworks in the NATO-Ukraine cooperation and the NATO-Georgia cooperation that pretty much mirror image these Adriatic Charter issues. It's the same, basically a lot of working groups pretty much overlap, and it's the same issues that you need to reform. There is a more diplomatic toss-up with Hungary playing his minority issue with regard to Ukraine in NATO all the time, which has prevented some groups from going further than they actually could be. The problem is that all these leave out Moldova, because Moldova by constitution is a neutral country, and it has no deeper cooperative framework with NATO. It does some cooperation with NATO countries bilaterally, particularly Romania, also with the Americans and the Brits. But there is no institutional or no guiding framework, and there are a lot of legal obstacles because of Moldovan neutrality to do so. Still, the reform steps in the defense sector are the same. So in these things, I think sort of neither one fits Moldova. I mean, observer status would be perfect, but I think here I'd call for EU-NATO cooperation to kind of have, because NATO has the practical knowledge for defense reform on the ground. The EU doesn't. The EU does not have bureaucrats who know defense, because it's not a defense organization. But the EU has other neighborhood processes. It can take on NATO personnel, staff, and agendas to kind of promote it vis-a-vis Moldova. Actually, this sort of on beyond Cyprus and Turkey and Hungary, practical in the field cooperation between staff of both organizations is good, despite of the conspiracies you hear on other. These two organizations don't hate each other. They very much work hand to hand in different fields. One is economic and the other is more military. But Moldova would be a case in point to kind of deepen this to a level to help the Moldovans out reform their armed forces and their military security apparatus to a kind of Western compatible standards, but it has to be organized through an EU umbrella for legal reasons. Although, of course, the problem is pretty much the same. Their army is by and large useless in the current state, and they need to get better.
In Southeastern Europe, we have the newest NATO members, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia. Maybe that would be some learning effect for the future NATO members. Is that possible, you think?
Well, they have very specific defense needs. So, for example, when we wrote the security compact, we had a lot of colleagues from Balkan countries and say, well, that's a great idea. Let's do the same for Bosnia. Let's do the same for Kosovo. Let's do the same for Serbia. The thing is, on practical terms, is that the defense needs are enormously different compared to Ukraine or Georgia to Albania, for example. In Albania, most of the reform needs are connected to rule of law, separation of power, preventing state capture, making especially military intelligence accountable player in sort of domestic power games, or actually a non-player in domestic power games, but a real military security operation, not a kind of shadow state. In Ukraine, it's a different game. So the army is there to fight for the survival of the country. The military intelligence has all hands up to kind of block Russian saboteurs, and they have capacity building programs on cross-border signal intelligence, Russian troop movements, etc. A whole portfolio of capabilities they need on top of the rule of law agenda that is there for the Balkan countries that needs to be done. So I think these comparisons have very narrow limits. The Georgians and Ukraine, for Moldova, they think they would be more applicable, yes, because Moldova is more of a domestic constituency rule of law thing. But for Ukraine, Georgia, there's much more hardcore fighting thing that needs to be dealt with than with all the other West Balkan countries. If some of the West Balkan countries don't have such effective fighting force that nationalist leaders might use to do stupid things, I'm actually not too unhappy about it. In the case of Ukraine and Georgia, weak defense apparatus is a much more severe liability.
Gustav, one last question. You have written a 2016 report about the European Union attitudes towards Ukraine. It's a very famous report, online available. It's also the way we got acquainted when you came to Ukraine for presenting it. And it's also my question now, because you know very well the Austrian foreign policy and the Austrian policy towards Eastern Europe, the German one. These are because you live now in Berlin, I'm sure you're acquainted with all the experts in this field. Can you make a little bit of a comparison between the German and Austrian foreign policy towards Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe? And can you make some evaluation? And what is your wish for both countries? Maybe also to include Nord Stream 2, because both countries are part of it, and make a conclusion. What's your wish for both countries to do in the coming years?
So to make it short, Austria, unfortunately, is what Germany was before 2014. A country that has a clear Russia first focus, a country that doesn't really take the Eastern neighbors seriously on their own weight, a country that is very happy to get in bed with autocrats and embrace the concept of authoritarian stability over even its long-term economic interests in developing these countries as future markets and trade partners. Austria is a country that rather adapts and profits from corruption rather than fighting it. So in that case, if you compare Austria's role as a positive transformation anchor under, for example, the Vranitzky-Mock government to what it is now, I have to say that Austria's standing and seriousness and policy capacity and sincereness has rapidly, and of course, corruption and rule of law standards, just reminding you of the BFET's scandals and all these things that happen, and Wirecard. has greatly deteriorated and slipped to the worse. And I hope this will revert under any new kind of leadership. I don't see this with the current political class, but I just hope. I don't know what to do about it, unfortunately. In Germany was this before 2014, and there is a learning curve taking place also enormously slowly. And I would say exclusively, or almost exclusively, I know some older Germans who also got the learning curve. I don't want to insult them, but predominantly amongst younger officials and politicians. This is also why you see it sort of this kind of trench war now between Laschet and Baerbock, which is not only about sort of the appeal of the candidates and the ideological difference between the parties and the importance of climate change, but it's also a kind of approach and way of policy making between two generations of German politicians that are fundamentally different. For the Laschet generation, and that applies to also, I actually personally like Merkel, but she also has her weaknesses. All political questions are basically can be broken down to institutional, economic, and integration processes on that level. Sometimes solve themselves by basically itself. That's much of the thinking of this generation, because they were brought up in the 90s, and that's the way they thought. In the younger generation, they know that many of the issues we face today are deeply political, and they need a political solution, and sometimes this political solution means to apply hard force. And that economic transactions will not solve political issues by themselves unless you have a political will and the political guts to tackle them. Whether the Greens have the best ideas to do, though, I might dispute that, but at least they know the problem. And that's part of the appeal of the Green Party now, because larger parts of the German society have gotten a notice that many of the problems, from Russian subversion to right radical terrorism, to Russia's encroachment of the eastern neighborhood, to corruption in Germany and abroad, all these things are political, not administrative, not economic, they're political. And this learning curve that slowly unfolds, that has first taken place, I would say, in academia and administrative level, and is now spilling over into the political class. We'll see, I think, Germany, fortunately, moving a bit to the better. Germany still is a very reluctant engager in all kinds of stuff, whether this will be sort of stopping Orban from being completely nasty to banging the table, or trying to stop Russia. It will be enormously reluctant. On Russia itself, a lot of the positive things Germany did was there because Merkel was, from her personal experience with Russian intelligence services, correctly read what a character Putin is and how you need to negotiate with him. And that was her personal advantage. Baerbock would, if she would succeed her, of course, be from the same corner of German society, the church-linked evangelical anti-communist movement, which is a good thing, but the rest of the party, the pockets of the party that is not fully on board with that, but that's a discussion of another matter. But of course, the problem with the problem with Merkel is that in many ways she is just on policy implementations let things slip, and she only trusted people who were 100% loyal to her and never had a different opinion, which led her to actually scare out pretty good cadres, both in administration and ministers, like AKK being the prime example, but not the only one, who've basically be pushed aside because she perceived them insufficiently loyal. But on the other side, these people are just, all politicians are some kind of alpha males, even if they're females. They're trying to be leaders, and they try to have their own agenda and opinion. And the stronger they are, the worse this gets. And hence now Germany is administered by a lot of top politicians and a lot of top bureaucrats who are only mediocre at best. And you see this from counterintelligence, how dysfunctional this is, up to the vaccination issue, that this kind of administrative sluggishness is basically making Germany also punching a lot under its weight. And I hope that whatever the new government will look like, what kind of color assembly it will get, that this is sort of the thing that they will start to tackle.
And in the run-up of the NATO summit now in 2021 in June, do you expect some changes from the Austrian or German government in relation to Nord Stream 2, and that they order the state companies and also to withdraw from that project?
No, I fear sort of the current German government wants to push this through and complete it before the elections, because they know that they fear, and they probably rightfully fear, that the next government would stop it if it came to power before that. And it's very unfortunate, and a very, because the Germans have declared the other things that they're doing now. It's a very insincere, especially to the Biden administration, a very unpolite way to kind of not go into any compromises with the Americans. Biden also being a difficult position, trying to restore the alliance on the one hand, and being bound to Congress and to the rule of law, to laws that bind him to sanctions. On the other hand, it's a tricky position for him, and the Germans do nothing, really nothing, to help him out, which is a really bad starter for the remending of American-German ties now. So the pipeline will be finished when the new German government comes into power. Whether then they will start to put it into operation is a different question. So now there are a lot of proposals and thinking, and sort of how to deal with the pipeline as a political leverage, and put conditionalities on the operational procedures. Also, because the Americans still have sanctions, and their financial sanctions, and Biden could still enact this, there's a great reluctance from the side of the insurance companies to cover the operation of the pipeline. And the problem is, if you look at sort of the Baltic Sea, is a very narrow, very shallow sea. It's not like the Atlantic. Usually it's 25 meters, and there's only a narrow ditch towards Sweden where it's a bit deeper. Very shallow waters. You have the big Polish port of Swinemünde right next to Rügen, where sort of and Greifswald, where the pipeline has the landfall. So the problem is that you have a lot of shipping right over, and the shipping lane is 10 meters deep, and the Baltic Sea soil is not much further there, and there dug in is the pipeline. If you have any kind of shipping incident along that route, it will immediately might affect the pipeline and the security and integrity of the pipeline, and leaking gas might provide a hazard to ships passing. It's a very tricky issue from the point of view of maritime safety. And if no insurance company in Europe or in the West wants to cover the risk associated with the pipeline, you can't operate them, because the risk of an accident is there, and you need to cover them, and you need to cover them in Western money, in euros or dollars. You can't cover them in, rubles or Zimbabwe dollars or whatever.
Let me ask you, the President Zelensky was in Vienna in September 2020, and he was asking very kindly Austria to withdraw the support for the Nord Stream 2. In Austria, we also have a green government together with the conservatives. But still, Austria, for me, I don't know what is the reason. While we have very strong links via the Ukrainian pipeline system, traditionally since 50 years, Austrian CEO, Mr. Seele from OMV, is the key spokesperson in some way and promoter of Nord Stream 2. What exactly is the reason for that?
Oh, well, the problem is, how much can I talk now without getting into liability law issues? So the Austrian Green Party is different from the German Green Party, ideologically and color-wise. The second thing is the level of sort of corruptive subversion and top-level corruption, of course, in Austria is much higher than in Germany. Even though in Germany, this Nord Stream 2 is a corruption problem. It's really a corruption problem. So the political influence of enterprises like the OMV is X-fold stronger than the political influence of companies like Wintershall in Germany. And yes, OMV is deeply involved with Russia in various business projects. There are some people in the energy field that consider OMV as a Gazprom subsidiary, which technically, legally, of course, is not true, but politically it seems to be very true. So Russia is, so Austria is often not speaking up in terms of its own interests. It's speaking up in terms of Russian interests because certain CEOs, politicians live a very fortunate life representing Russian interests, if you let me call it this way. Yes, so for Austria, it's sort of, I mean, it would hardly matter whether you have the one or the other pipeline system that supplies the gas. There might be, for OMV commercially, of course, there's something in it to go with Nord Stream 2 because Nord Stream 2 is, because of the sanctions on Russian banking sector, Nord Stream 2 needs to, in order to finance Nord Stream 2, Gazprom needs to resort to kind of swap asset deals in Europe, and OMV is instrumental to that. And of course, therefore, for various reasons, there is a margin of gains for OMV and for its top brass in that business. So they have, of course, as company, a business case to be in that, but it doesn't serve a kind of Austrian national interest in terms of energy supply. That's a different factor. It will replace natural gas from one pipeline to natural gas from another pipeline. So it doesn't really matter. That said, yeah, the sort of political sincereness is a different matter in Berlin and Vienna, unfortunately.
Gustav, the OMV also got two gas fields during the EU sanctions in Russia. Yeah. I was surprised. One of them is not very successful or was not closed, but the other one was given. Doesn't that undermine the sanctions or the idea, the spirit of sanctions, when you get such huge, lucrative gas deals in Russia during these times?
Yes, of course. I mean, Austria was also instrumental in watering down the sanctions. So, for example, the sectoral sanctions on the banking system does not touch these European subsidiaries of the Russian state-owned banks. Of course, all European subsidiaries of Russian state-owned banks reside in Vienna. And Austria in 2014 said it would only agree to sanctions if they were exempted. And from now, sort of Russian financial operations all run through Vienna because they have the subsidiaries there, and their financial operations in the rest of Europe is organized through Vienna. If you see legal or economic presence of Sberbank or VTB or Gazprom Bank somewhere in Germany or popping up in Denmark, it's always the local branch in Vienna legally acting there. Of course, the orders are given in Moscow, but they're sort of legally it's the Vienna branch because they under European law are European banks and exempted for sanctions. So it's not only OMV, it's a much wider things where Austria is really a subversive tool and not really playing along with European policies.
Gustav, do you think we need more European unity on the energy question, on financial markets, on foreign policy issues in the future in order to be able to contain Russia?
One moment. Oben Garderobe, oben liegt das.
I promise it's the last question because you gave me 2
Yeah.
hours. I'm very happy. Just as a kind of start with the Council, with the future of Europe now, do you think we need to be more united?
Yeah, but the problem is how to achieve that. With the European Union of 27 countries and with such heterogeneous interests, especially in economic affairs and with rule of law problems in many countries. And here I'm not only pointing on Bulgaria or possible EU accession of whomever. Here I'm pointing also on countries like Vienna, and I'm pointing to a certain extent also on countries like Germany in the sort of wake up of the Wirecard scandal and its political implications. The problem is at some point we really need to have enforcing structures in Brussels that are more robust. The Commission tries to create them. In the banking sector, because of the financial crisis, they're starting to become effective. On energy, I'm still a fan of Donald Tusk's Energy Union proposals. They would be great in solving the whole conundrum about Nord Stream 2. There would be, if Germany would have said yes to that, there would have been much less political quarrels about all the fuss that we have now. they declined at the time, which was a big mistake. I think such a sort of expanding the Commission's role as an energy regulator and as an energy market rule enforcers would shrink the kind of private spaces companies like OFV has carved out for themselves in spaces like Austria, where via political influence they have gained a kind of immunity for whatever they do, because you can't box yourself into political immunity in Vienna, but doing that in Brussels, that's an enormously that's a different game, you know. And then for Bulgarian oligarchs and for Orban, it would be the same. You know, you can privatize your own country into your own pocket, but you can't do that on the European scale. It's just too big to be so dependent and to be whacked by the tail. So here we need, first and foremost, much deeper integration in many executive fields. Energy being one of them, finances, surveillance are one of them, and to some part, and on domestic security, rule of law, a European prosecutory office, and a European criminal court would be for high-profile crimes, corruption, subversion, and espionage. Would be a dream come true for me. There is so much you can do on a European level if you have appropriate oversight institutions that simply you can't do in Cyprus, in Austria, in Malta, in Ireland unilaterally, because structures are too weak. That's sort of big lessons learned. Unfortunately, we are still very far away from them, but it's, to my point of view, it's the only way to go.
This was very optimistic conclusion of Gustav Gressel from the from the European Foreign Policy think tank, ECFR, one of the best and brightest of Austria, now working in Berlin. Thanks for your time. It was very interesting, very challenging, and a lot of important issues were touched. I would like to thank you very much for your interview, and all the best in your continuous work for a united Europe, strong and ready to contain Russia. Please.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for hosting me. Bye.